Good morning, happy Sunday. I just wanted to come on this morning to talk about what is a tiny home. There's a lot of confusion about what it actually is. And the tiny police are around too. So I wanted to hopefully dispel some myths and give you a clearer idea of what a tiny home is, so that you can, if you're interested in tiny home living, you can figure out what it is. So I remember back 2003, I think, no, 2002, I bought my first house. Now my first house was 2,000 square feet, probably 2,500 if you counted the basement. I had spent 3 years living in an 800 square foot 2-bedroom apartment with my young daughter. I think she was in kindergarten when we finally bought the house. The apartment had been cramped mainly because I was just living a bigger life in a smaller space, but mainly because it was so badly designed. Most small houses are. So when we moved into our 2,000 square foot house, 2,500 square foot really, we rattled around it. Even though it had felt cramped in our 800 square feet, we rattled around this 2,500 square feet. Fast forward 6, 7 or 8 years later, I had another child, and all of a sudden I had a packed house. The basement was so packed with stuff, I couldn't even use it. I mean, there was a pathway from the front to the back. I couldn't use the basement, so it basically 500 square feet of living space wasn't livable because of the stuff. And I'd gotten to the point where just knowing that the basement was so stuffed full of things, stressed me out, even if I was nowhere near the basement. And every time I went down there, I was hit in the face, sometimes literally, by the fact that it was absolutely stuffed. And then I thought I wanted to think about downsizing my stuff and downsizing my house into something that was a lot smaller. So I got some stats here. In 1973, the average American home was 1,660 square feet, which by today's standard is not a big home. The average American home now is about 2,600 square feet. That's 1,000 square feet more. This house I live in is just over 1,000 square feet. And this is the difference, you know, so we've doubled the size of housing that's being built in the last 40, 50 years. And so you've added a whole other house. But in those times, families have shrunk, actually, according to the stats. We used to be 3.5 people in a household, and now the average is 2.5. So we got fewer people in much bigger homes, and they're still stuffed. They're still too small. And a lot of us end up moving up into 3,000 square feet, 4,000 square feet. And every time we add a new family member, we think we gotta get a bigger house because we're not gonna fit all in this space. And so you end up getting a bigger house and a bigger mortgage, and the stress of having to pack all that stuff up and move it and then put it away has a lot of us thinking, if I could just live in a tiny home, I wouldn't have to deal with all of this stress. So what is tiny? Strictly speaking, according to the tiny police, a tiny house is 500 square feet or less. Those that are 5 to 1,000 are considered to be small, but by American standards, if 2,600 square feet is normal, is average, 1,000 square feet is less than half, is tiny. But tiny homes under 500 square feet come in all shapes and sizes. I know people who lived on boats, who live in RVs, who have built this tiny house on wheels. City apartments can be tiny, little bungalows, granny flats. And there's a situation to fit anyone who wants to radically downsize. You know, a lot of people end up in, by choice or not, assisted living facilities. That's tiny living too. You have a community, but it's still tiny living. So, but a tiny home isn't just a bigger home that got shrunk in the wash. The design is different. In order to really effectively live in a tiny home, the design has to be different. A lot of my struggles when in smaller spaces, and in this space I'm in right now, and in another live when I talk about kitchen design, I can show you how badly designed this space is, because this space was built with a bigger space mentality. It just shrunk. So there's a lot of dead space. There's a lot of space that's not utilized or utilizable because it's blocked behind decorative paneling that doesn't actually look that great and, and takes away storage space and usable space. So you have to be a lot more intentional when designing your space and really think about how you live in your home and how to fit your stuff into it, because in a bigger home, 2, 3, 4, 5,000 square feet, you don't really have to be intentional until it's filled with stuff. There is space to fill without thinking about it. There is space to put a 6-burner range, despite the fact that when you actually come down to look at it, you only ever use 2 or 3 of those burners. I mean, when we go to buy a new stove, very often the first thing that you think about is, what is the space between the cabinets that I have to fill, and I'm going to fill it. There's no thought of, well, how many burners do I really need? How big of an oven do I really need? So in living in a tiny house, the design of it and the living in it requires you to be a lot more intentional and really think about what it is you use in the home. The biggest fear, though, that most people have when they're moving into a tiny home, and I've spoken to numerous people, and it's all the same thing. They dream of living in a tiny home, but they don't know whether their stuff is going to fit. They don't know whether their family is going to fit in terms of finding privacy, and in terms of, you know, living, holding parties. And I spoke last week about having in this small space 10 teenagers, and it really wasn't a struggle. It did require some preparation and some thinking and some flexible space and furniture, but really it's doable with intention, with prior planning and preparation, which is a different way of living, because in a bigger space you don't have to think. So it's easier because decisions and you don't have to make them. So when you're taking the time to consider, when you're considering moving into a smaller home, what I always recommend is you start living tiny in the space you're in and start really looking at how you live and what you really need. And we're going to be talking about that in future lives, so that you can prepare and figure out what space you actually need. Now I went from 2,500 square feet, which was absolutely jam-packed, to I'm now in 1,000 square feet, and it's clearing out. I won't say it's not. It's clear and it's clean, and but it is actually easier to live in. I got rid of 2/3 to 3/4 of the contents of the house. Don't miss any of it. I love having the extra space because it makes living easier, and it makes cleaning easier too, because if you've got nothing to tidy away, which is another intentional living, will mean at the end of the day you don't have anything to tidy away. It's a breeze to just whip through with a broom and clean bathrooms, so much easier. And I probably have a fraction of the housework that my friends have, because I don't have anything to put away and my space is smaller to start with. If I was to vacuum the house, it would take me half the time than a bigger house, because obviously it's half the size. So please let me know where it is you struggle with the idea of moving into a tiny home and really figuring out what kind of space you need, and I will try and address them in a future live. So thank you for joining me, and have a great Sunday.